in the context of the SDGs and how we could move into these new and comprehensive data production ecosystems. So, Jaco, it's my pleasure to give you the floor, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this opportunity also to talk about how does an international organization like UNESCO actually produce and share and monitor information on the SDGs. I would, as you might know, that UNESCO's mandate is quite wide, and within this mandate, we collect a lot of data on the SDGs, where UNESCO is the custodian of several indicators. Within my section on universal access to information, we look specifically at collecting data on access to information. So the number of countries that adopt and implement constitutional and statutory policy guarantees for public access to information. And for that, we have used very traditional ways of collecting data, where we have a national questionnaires that are destined to oversight bodies for access to information. We have institutional questionnaires for public authorities like ministries of environment or finance and others. And once we receive this data, we also verified it then with UNESCO databases on countries with access to information laws. So it's a very traditional way of collecting data as an institution that is intergovernmental. But when we collect this data, I think we also realize that we need additional sources of data and have to look at other ways of collecting data, specifically within the realm of access to information. We sent originally our questionnaires to SDG focal points, but they were not familiar with the national or institutional implementation of access to information legislation. And then we had to look at additional recipients of our questionnaires. Also, when these bodies actually receive our questionnaires, of course, we had very grand plans to have full data sets, but people are not familiar with our terminologies or the specialized terminologies that we're using as it relates to SDGs. And that ended up that people did not provide all the data that we needed. And some cases incomplete responses because relevant bodies do not necessarily see the importance of collecting this data. And then finally, a point that I wanted to mention is data ownership. We collect data from public institutions, but we also encourage civil society groups to collect data on access to information, because they can, for example, produce shadow reports on, say, the question of access to information. But how do we put this data together so that we could make sure that the government institutional information is a source and a civil society organization is put within in the right context? And these are open questions that at least we still struggle with. Now, in order to address these elements, I think we try to look specifically at the FAIR guiding principles, which is findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, as a prism in order to say, now, how do we manage this data so that we benefit from data sharing and minimize some of the risks from the origin of these data? Now, in terms of findability, UNESCO works in cooperation with the interagency and expert groups on SDGs to validate the metadata to ensure that UN statistical standards are followed. So I think that we are quite fine with. We also based our questionnaire specifically on implementation, on some of the principles related to access to information that we had to interpret with a group of stakeholders. In terms of accessibility, We publish our data on dedicated platforms where people can download, visualize, and analyze the data. But how do we bring the different data sources together? And I think that's still an open question. We also, while we collect data on a very specific indicator, we want also to look at the interoperability of this data. For example, how does the data that we collect on access to information can be can be seen through the prism of gender, for example, or through the prism of SDG 9, which is on industrial cooperation. And this is something that we haven't succeeded yet, in my view, that we collect SDG information in our box, but how do we put these different boxes together? I know UNDP through the MAPS initiative try to do that, but I think we're still a far way of really putting this together. And then in terms of reusability, we make sure that the data producers, the government, the civil society, or others are very well attributed in terms of the data, so that when we mix it, we can actually see that where it comes from, to put the context as we look at official data. So when we look towards a new comprehensive data production system, I think it's important that when we look at the SDGs, that we realize that SDGs are not freestanding, but subject to each other. And I think this is a challenge that we have to try to solve and to work more on. We have to realize that different organizations are involved. So while governments or statistical services are our primary clients in terms of producing this information, I think we also need to look out of the box, as you said, towards the private sector, towards data scraping and other elements, and how do we do that? And then lastly, I would like to mention also the importance of, when we look at the sharing of this, to pay more attention on open access policies. UNESCO has an open access policy, but how do we apply it to open data? How do we move forward in terms of open data when we look at official data? And I think these are all open questions that we might want to look at. I'll stop there, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Maybe we will get back to you in the next round. But I do believe that UNESCO is doing a very important, playing a very important role in this new data governance ecosystem production, I would say, because of course access to information is very critical to UNESCO and open data. So and I have been following what UNESCO is doing, and I guess that not only UNESCO but also other UN agencies are really very will play an increasingly important role in terms of providing a debate around these issues that we have mentioned: data interoperability, accessibility, open data, and also all the things that comes with that, like privacy, which is a very important topic that I hope we can discuss in the next with the next speakers. So thank you very much, Jacob, for this very important contribution to this debate. And now I would like to welcome Daniel Kerr from OECD, that I have already introduced him. He was with the difficulties to connect. Welcome, Daniel. I would like to invite you to share and to provide your view on the issue of alternative data sources versus traditionally designed survey data, and the challenge associated with each of these type of data. And I know that I have been following also very closely all the work that OECD is doing in terms of this topic of data sharing, of having access to alternative data sources. So I really appreciate, Daniel, your willingness to share with us what OECD is doing in this regard. You have the floor for about 8 minutes.
Thank you, Alexandra. Firstly, I'm sorry I was late. I was trying desperately to get in, but not knocking hard enough, it seems. But I'm here now, and I'm not sure I'll be able to cover everything the OECD is doing in this area, but I'll certainly talk about some things from my area and do my best to touch on some of the wider work. So, the first thing I think we need to say is that it's not really about surveys or alternative sources that you mentioned. It's definitely about surveys and complementary sources. They each have their own strengths and limitations that can be complementary to each other. So well-designed surveys do a great job of measuring a huge range of economic and social phenomena across different sectors. So households, businesses, government, non-profits, and all the way down to individuals as well. And they're a well-established approach, and there's a wide literature on how we can ensure the results that we get from surveys are appropriately representative and robust. Nevertheless, surveys do have shortcomings, and these include cost and the burden on respondents, and often a trade-off between timeliness and representativeness. But also surveys are not great at measuring some things, and that's certainly one area that we can draw on other data sources as a complement. So data from other sources might be useful to help us address some of these shortcomings and to help us provide insights in those areas where surveys don't work so well. And we need to design this complementary system between the two. Now, I just want to quickly say that my area of the OECD, we're concerned with measuring and analysing the digital economy, and there are certainly some areas that seem like they could be worked on with information held by key businesses in particular. So e-commerce, for example, surveys do a good job of telling us how many firms engage in e-commerce, but other sources could help us better understand the volume of e-commerce revenues or the share that e-commerce is in monetary terms. There's another area that we're very interested in is the international flows of cloud computing services, which are quite abstract and confusing in terms of how they're structured. Online platforms, which I'm sure will come up repeatedly, especially platforms allowing people to sell their labor or their times or their skills. Issues related to well-being, so things like exposure to misinformation online. It would sure be interesting to get some information from social networks on that. And thinking about the SDGs, one example that came to me was there is an SDG indicator, the broadband subscriptions per 100 inhabitants split down by speed. Firstly, it'd be great if we could get some information from that we know businesses must hold on whether these are business or consumer subscriptions. That's currently not something that's widely shared and known, but should be something the businesses selling them those services know. And also real world network speeds versus what the network says the speed should be. I mean, these networks must be monitoring the speeds of traffic through their networks, so should be able to share some information on that if they were willing to. And there's many more areas where we could think of synergies like this. But there's certainly a number of key challenges. And I think the first one is understanding what we, as in statisticians, we really want, and articulating that in a way that makes sense to businesses. So when we talk about data sharing, it's really, really easy to get confused between sharing data sets and make it sound like we just want Facebook to hand over their entire data set that underpins their entire business, for example, or sharing statistics derived from those data sets. In general, our aim as statisticians is to produce summary statistics. That does not need to require the data sets themselves to be shared, although it would be nice if they could be. So this, to some extent, is a question of division of labor, but it can also be a way of managing concerns around commercial sensitivity. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the processes that we have to create the statistics are robust and they deliver comparability, aggregatability in the data, etc. But to do that, we can agree the way that the summary statistics are to be calculated, and I will touch upon some examples from the OECD's distributed microdata projects that sort of offer a potential model for this in a moment. I think we also need to be clear to ourselves and to the businesses. Are we asking for information about the business itself, or are we asking for information about their customers? So in the case of a platform, is that the people or businesses supplying services and using services through the platform rather than the platform itself? Now, there is a blurring of lines there, but we need to be clear that we understand what we're asking for first. The second key challenge I'd like to highlight is that businesses and statisticians really tend to look at the world in quite different ways. What sound to us as statisticians like basic statistics can sound like a really scary, commercially sensitive map of their entire business and how they make their money and where from. Or even worse, concepts like GDP have been described to me and workshops that you were at, Alexandra, as an irrelevance by some businesses that came to talk to us. So we need to find a common language and way of articulating what we're looking for. And also some established statistical norms, such as the idea that you can identify the production of a good or service to a geographic place and its consumption to a geographic place. Those don't necessarily apply really well to firms that operate multinationally without borders, essentially. But nevertheless, what we can do is try and find some ways to encourage firms to share data if we can find a common way of understanding and talking to them. So one thing that firms and statisticians actually increasingly agree on is that data are an asset. But for a business, an asset is not something they would normally share for free. So we need to find a value proposition that works for the firms, where they can say, look, this isn't just about me giving something that is great for the statisticians, but I don't really get anything in return. They need to see a value in that sharing. So this could be linked to efficiency, linked to reducing burdens on them, linked to corporate social responsibility, so the firm feel like they're doing something good, and linked to giving them a real picture of the market that they operate in. There are various things there. Or, of course, one could talk about taking legislative action to secure data sharing. But really, if I go back to those multinational firms that operate across countries without borders, that's going to require a huge amount of coordination across countries. And furthermore, at the moment already, the powers that different statistical agencies have in different countries to request data varies a lot. So you'd be starting from a very heterogeneous base. To encourage firms to share data, we also need to encourage them to have confidence in data sharing. So one way to ensure this or to facilitate this is through legal frameworks and instruments. So we need a common legal understanding of what is expected by the parties and how that can be enforced legally if necessary. And one thing that we found at the OECD may help is provision of information through trusted third parties. So businesses are used to disclosing information to their accountants. So there may be a sort of conduit through them that can help as well. And those accountants can help to provide assurance on the legal frameworks. There's also a lot of technical aspects. So things like, how is the data going to be stored and processed? Is it going to be secure? Is it going to be up to the right standards? And there's a need to bring in the right people on both sides to have those technical conversations. And to help businesses understand what can be shared while remaining within the rules on privacy, such as GDPR. Then it's also worth highlighting that the independence of statistical agencies from government can be an important string to our bow. In many OECD countries, at least, the national statistics offices are set up at arm's length from government, and that to help safeguard the statistics that they produce from interference. We can also leverage that to say, look, you know, we're not going to have the tax agency coming in the back door and double checking what you said on your tax filing last year. There's a degree of separation between these arms of government. A couple of other things to highlight. So there's things like data anonymization that we can use. So, and this can include not only anonymizing the subject of the data, but also potentially its source. And that can be important in markets where if we're able to get enough firms around the table together to manage disclosiveness, so in a concentrated market like that for infrastructure as a service, cloud services, there's only 3 big players in infrastructure as a service. If you go to one of them and ask them where they make their money, they say that's a map of my business. If you go to 3 of them and you can actually convince them to talk to each other and provide the same data to a trusted third party, for aggregation, then once you've aggregated that data, you have some degree of disclosure control that you can hopefully win them on board with. Another issue to highlight is statistical limitations. So we need to try and understand what the limitations of these sources could be, find ways to mitigate them, and otherwise to communicate them. And importantly, and I'll come on to this very briefly in a second with an example, you ideally want to be able to continue the production of these statistics over time. It's all well and good doing it once, but statisticians want to do things over and over. This isn't just analysis. And finally, one thing I think for us as statisticians is a willingness to take risks. We need to be willing to put in the resources to try to pursue data sharing despite the uncertainty over whether you'll have success. And I've seen several times in several organizations, the ideas are there, but we stop short of the line of actually putting the resources there, because you don't want to have to go back at the end of the process and report that you didn't get where you hoped. But you need to try and take these risks. So I'll just quickly highlight a couple of models that have worked for us at the OECD and elsewhere actually. So we've had success with several one-off models. So this is great for analysis, but not a basis for those regular statistics I was talking about. So we've used contractual instruments such as non-disclosure agreements to get detailed transaction data from Spanish banks. And that allowed us to do some interesting analysis. We've also been approached by some of the businesses we're interested in working with about actually implanting our analysts into those businesses for a short period of time to do some analysis and produce statistics that we could then take out. But this is one of those examples where there wasn't the resource or the appetite for risk to really embrace that opportunity. I mentioned the broadband statistics earlier. We have some OECD statistics that are gathered through regulators. Of course, regulators have regulatory power, but they tend to operate in markets that have a relatively small number of players. And this also shows the benefit of having sort of personal relationships with those players. And some of the other markets that we're interested in may not have regulators in the same way, but they do have small numbers of players that we can try and build relationships with. And I'd just like to highlight a success that Eurostat had recently actually on this. So Eurostat, after long and detailed negotiations, managed to secure an agreement with 4 short stay accommodation platforms to regularly share data on nights books and guests that can be aggregated into statistics. While we're waiting to see the tangible outcomes of that, because these things take time, the agreement is there, and it shows that breakthroughs are possible if you put the effort in, and that international organizations can play an important coordinating role and potentially offer a value proposition to some of these businesses, as well as on behalf of our member countries. So I think basically by saying, look, if you had the choice as a business of completing one standardized submission agreed across countries, rather than many heterogeneous submissions done with each individual country, that could offer them some value in terms of time saved, efficiency. And that is an approach we're also trying to make work with reporting on terrorist, violent and extremist content here at the OECD. We've also had success in bringing together groups of stakeholders from business and the statistics domain around the table, around a common measurement purpose. And you can see some of the outcomes of this in the OECD.ai portal, observatory portal that has several indicators on it. And of course, none of this, we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are markets that can exist for data. You know, it can be easy to overlook this, but there are already examples where private enterprises are selling access to data to those producing statistics, including the OECD. But of course, one of the big problems is that supply and demand don't necessarily reveal themselves organically in a way that gives a market solution. So related to that, I'd just like to highlight two pieces of OECD work related to data sharing. The first is a recommendation of the Council concerning access to research data from public funding. And basically what that says is that if you're a private company or anyone doing research that was funded by the public purse, the data should be shared as widely as they reasonably can be. The second is a 2019 report called Enhancing Access to and Sharing of Data, Reconciling Risks and Benefits for Data Reuse Across Societies. This takes a much wider perspective than just the perspective of producing statistics, but many of the points in there are relevant to sharing for statistical purposes, including the need to balance the benefits of enhancing data openness with the risks and the need to recognize legitimate private and national and social public interests when deciding where the balance lies. The need to reinforce trust and empower users through proactive stakeholder engagement and community building. And the examples I just touched upon are basically examples of that. It's putting in the time and the legwork to talk to companies and try and build a community around a shared purpose. And finally, encouraging the provision of data through incentive mechanisms that make sense and hang together. So to draw it all together, I think in all cases, it's important to understand that the process is going to be resource intensive and it requires a lot of dialogue to bear fruit. This requires willingness on both sides, including the willingness to take and manage risks, both for the business and for the statistical agencies. And we need to build on the successes that there have been to illustrate the value propositions that there can be for businesses and to strengthen those value propositions, to make it easy to get groups of competitor companies in a room to talk to each other about the practicalities of data sharing for statistical purposes, and overall to try and actually just normalize targeted, controlled, and appropriate data sharing for statistical purposes. So that was a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It was indeed very interesting. And I was saying in my initial remarks that the ticket for the future, as said by Robert Gross, is this combination of data sources, like design data, survey data, admin data, and organic data sources, such as big data. And of course, that you brought one very important topic, which is the distinction between what is really data sharing. Does it mean providing access to data sets or just sharing the statistical results? So right now, I just would like to mention that in Brazil, we are working with IBGE, which is our National Statistical Office. They had real access to the data set from a mobile operator in the metropolitan area of Rio de Janeiro, and they are doing, we are doing a model to try to estimate the proportion of the population using the internet and also the proportion of population covered by 3G and 4G networks. So those are statistics very easily produced by these type of CDRs from mobile operators. But of course, as you said, a data set became an asset. And so the value proposition and how we are going to have access to these data, all the legal agreements and commercial agreements, it is a very important issue to be discussed. But now, since we have now heard from UNESCO and OECD, two international organizations, I would like to listen what the National Statistical Offices are doing and what are their thoughts in terms of these new data production ecosystems and data sharing. And I would like to give the floor to Mark Huber from Statistics Canada. And maybe, Mark, it is thank you for being with us today. As we all know, Statistics Canada is a best practice reference in terms of data production, statistics production. And I would like to hear from you, what do you believe that data users, such as policymakers, maybe a very hard user of data and statistics, what are they requiring in terms of data disaggregation, more complex data set? What are the views of data users? When Statistics Canada produces statistics, what are the users' requirements? And also, what do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced national statistical offices to look at alternative data sources and also alternative data collection methods, since for many surveys, we cannot go into the household or the companies or other establishments to collect data. So what are the roles of these new data sources? Mark, you have the floor for about 8 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandra. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today with such a distinguished group of guests, many of which I've had the fortune to work with over the past many years. And it's always a challenge to follow Dan, but I should be used to it by now. So, so a couple of points I'd like to make today. I think the first one will really kind of build on what Dan was talking about earlier, actually, in terms of, I think that we agree that really survey tools that we've used in the past alone really aren't going to get us there in terms of measuring what we want to in the future. So as we've talked about, there's a lot of advantages to some of those traditional methods that we've used, but we can certainly supplement and improve on those as well. So kind of going back to your question, actually, Alexandra, although the focus of this session is on the development of data to meet policy design and SDG monitoring needs, I think the topic's fairly timely and within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout the world, here in Canada as well, we've seen a need from policymakers for real-time or near real-time, high-quality information on an ongoing basis in order to attempt to try and make the best decisions possible during a dynamic situation. So in many countries, this data has come from the National Statistical Organization. Here in Canada, at Statistics Canada, we've been responsible for providing a lot of that. Although we've provided that information in a different fashion than we have done previously. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Statistics Canada was able to use some of our traditional tools of a statistician, using surveys and administrative data that already existed to show the effects and the potential effects of COVID on segments of the population and on certain sectors. So looking at the potential of people to telework from home, whether we could identify potential sectors of the economy that we expected to be hit relatively hard by this, areas of the service sector, of course, restaurants, tourism, things like that. So we were able to produce some of those statistics very quickly, but those tools alone were not sufficient to meet the needs of this sort of unprecedented situation that we found ourselves in. So within a matter of weeks, the agency reacted by supplementing some of these traditional sources with a series of crowdsourcing exercises, web panels, web scraping activities, and also mobility and satellite data that were obtained both through public sources and private sources. So the combination of the use of these methods allowed the agency to provide policymakers with a much better perspective on the effects of the pandemic on a widespread and national level, but then also on a much more granular level as we were able to get into some of the details. So for Statistics Canada, this was an area that we've been working on very much in the last few years. But I think what happened is really as a result of the pandemic, it accelerated many of these initiatives, and it really provided us with a bit more free license to explore some of these alternative data sources, especially, as you say, when traditional survey data could not be collected due to the lockdowns that were experienced here in Canada. And it allowed us to use some of these sources to measure impacts of COVID due to some of the shifts in consumer spending and some of the protective measures that were in place that restricted our movement. So although some of these metrics that we put out I think kind of in hindsight, perhaps were not perfect. The response allowed us as statisticians to learn very quickly the potential of some of these other data sources, and also provided policymakers with that up-to-date information that they needed to make better social, economic, and health decisions, and try and chart a course towards, number one, a safe recovery in terms of health, but also in terms of a financial recovery for the country. So I think it's clear that we couldn't have done this just by using traditional methods alone. They would have lacked some of the detail and timeliness required for the circumstances. So that's not to discount any of our traditional methods that we already have in place. In some cases, traditional survey tools will still provide some of the data that we need and the indicators that are necessary, both to monitor the SDGs in this example, but also meet the needs of policymakers. However, for new and somewhat emerging issues related to the digital transformation, which is my team's area of focus within the agency, I think we've recognized now that this just will not be enough. So I think when we look at sort of e-commerce transactions, the use of online platforms that Dan referenced earlier, there's really an opportunity to use big data, such as transaction level data or activity logs, to try and better measure this. And these non-traditional sort of privately held, potentially big data sources will provide some of the inputs to build the next generation of indicators as the digital transformation continues to evolve. So in many cases, the lessons learned by NSOs through the world since the onset of the pandemic can continue to be built upon as we go forward to further develop a comprehensive model that incorporates different data sources and data sharing mechanisms while still maintaining that integrity of the statistical system. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about that value proposition for data providers. Dan touched on the OECD's attempts to do this as well, and this is something that we've been faced with at Statistics Canada too. While there is that opportunity to partner with businesses who possess valuable data to help measure emerging data challenges, I think that we need to demonstrate to them why they should do this. And I think this is particularly true in the case of the digital economy. There's a lot of opportunity there where digital trails exist throughout. And in many cases, the best source of data for measurement are the providers of the services themselves who have built their firms on the information that they've gleaned from these big data sources. So for us at Statistics Canada and for many national statistical offices, there are two methods to attempt to obtain this type of data from private firms who often hold this, what they see as proprietary information, quite closely. The first is to try and compel the firms to provide it under legislation. However, for many of these firms that hold the data that we're trying to get related to digitalization, these are often multinational firms that have headquarters outside of the country, and our sort of legislative powers there are really quite limited in terms of providing that information. The second option is really to demonstrate this value proposition to firms. So if they're not compelled to provide the information, or even if for Canadian firms that are compelled to provide some information, what incentive do they have to provide better data to us and to do it on a more timely basis? If we all view data as an asset, then firms need to be able to sort of trade on that data that they're giving up and see the value in doing so. So in this case, the value that resides there is really, it equals helping to answer some of the country's policy questions and issues. So a couple of examples within Canada, we have made progress in terms of partnering with some private firms to provide key information that is used to produce indicators. We do have a partnership with many large retailers to provide scanner data. Statistics Canada uses that to build a more representative consumer price index. And this data source became key during the pandemic. It really served as a risk mitigation strategy when prices that are typically collected from the field we were unable to take that method, to use that method due to the health restrictions that were in place. As well, ongoing work that we have now with some of the major telecom providers could help to unlock some of the new metrics related to broadband and mobile services provision there. So those conversations, I think, are necessary as data now is really big business. Official statistics producers are no longer the only game in town. However, I think we still have a role to play there, and NSOs can demonstrate the value added through data analysis, linkage, and analytics, as well as the standards of quality that might be applied, which we apply. We're aiming for a higher degree of quality in many cases than some other data providers that are out there. And really, I think the point for us to make in obtaining some of these alternative data sources is that we can, as an NSO, we can do more with more information. We can paint the most accurate picture possible for the country. And the alternative to that is really that we can only sort of provide the information. The information that we provide is really limited by the information that's provided to us. And that could lead to potentially incorrect decision-making and policies. So finally there, I'd just like to also make the point, in order to facilitate data sharing, I think as a data steward, we must really establish trust with those whose data is provided to us. So to that end, Statistics Canada has created a trust center, which attempts to explain to firms and to individuals why their data is collected and how it is used, and really put that out there in a transparent fashion. As well, very importantly, it outlines how their data is protected once it comes into the agency, and then Statistics Canada's accountability framework. And really, that's all done with the idea of building that level of trust between those that provide information to us and ourselves who put it back out into the world. So I will leave it at that for this discussion, but thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting, and thanks for sharing all the difficulties and challenges that Statistics Canada is facing, like us or every other data producer is willing to use alternative data collection methods and data source. It is indeed a big challenge. You gave very good examples, and I think that national statistical offices such as yourself plays an important role in this debate, mainly within the UN statistical system and debates based on the fundamental principle of official statistics, how we are going to discuss this data governance for the production of official statistics. So thank you very much for your contribution. Maybe we get back to you if you have time. Now I would like to give the floor to another very relevant National Statistical Office, Statistics Poland, and I would like to invite Dominic. Dominic, I'm really very happy to see you here with us. Thank you so much for your kindness to bring your expertise and experience. Very recently, I joined a session with Dominic. I was as a participant in the UN Global Data, Big Data for Official Statistics conference, and I could witness all the innovation projects that Statistics Poland has under the leadership of Dominic. So Dominic, thank you so much. And I invite you to share with us all these innovations and your personal view as the president of Statistics Poland in terms of this new environment of data production.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander. I was deeply honored by this invitation. I did whatever I could to participate, even though I'm in a bad position a little bit, but for other reasons. But I would like to at least actually, say that I'm obsessed with the innovation in our office, and we're doing a lot of innovative projects. We want to be on a top of the world in terms of what we can do in the statistical office. And I think that there's a huge perspective of what we can still achieve together, working internationally together to tackle the new data sources and to make use of it and in favor of our societies, because this is our ultimate goal. And there are a few things that I would like to mention so that I wouldn't repeat myself with those who already spoke. First of all, I'd like to make a point about the challenges, because there's an important point in that, that we can assume that there are these, new data sources like administrative data, years back, and we have to tackle those sources somehow. But there are things that we have to consider, and I would like to mention 3 challenges. First challenge in terms of how the official statistics is organized, we are unfortunately, this is a joke and a serious thing at the same time, a part of the public authorities, so it conveys a lot of limitations in terms of how we can act. So in our case, many public authorities currently lack the capacity and skills to fully realize the potential of the data. So even though we would have the access, theoretically, probably wouldn't be able to take advantage of it. And we have to prepare for that. And there are a few initiatives, especially at the international level, that I would like to mention in a minute. Then the second challenge is that the vast majority of data is collected by the private sector, and there exists little economic incentives, yet many barriers like ethical, privacy-related, reputation to share data beyond any kind of like small projects and commercial projects as well. So this is a second limitation. And the third challenge that I'd like to mention is that there is a lack of dedicated professionals who are responsible for sharing of data externally for social benefits. So at the side of the companies as well, that we have to train some people that will be able to kind of like cooperate with the public sector and with the non-profit organizations as well, to kind of like flourish this data ecosystem that would enable us to exchange data and take advantage, of the data in a mutually, to all together, so that these are the 3 challenges that I would like to say that are very important. There are a few areas of applications that stand out really at the moment, that we can really imagine that if there would be a way to access the data, we would be able quickly to react in producing some interesting statistics. And just for the sake of having it as a complete discussion, I would like to mention it: mobile network operator data. That's pretty common. Everybody knows that. There was this fantastic case of API provided by Google and Apple recently in terms of the pandemic. I think that was a marvelous thing. But of course, that doesn't stop there. There are so many other applications that we can think about if we would only be able to access these data, and this is very, very, very difficult. The second area is financial transactions and online payments. We've always tried to do so, and there have been many private corporations in Poland, for example, which were able to provide some statistics based on this source in the time of epidemic. It was pretty meaningful. I think that it should go somehow into the mainstream of official statistics, because it really helps us to produce something that is meaningful, timely, and very granular. So that's the second area. The third area is something a little bit easier, I would say, the web intelligence data, the data that we can gather ourselves, but of course we have to prepare ourselves towards, these applications. We need to train people. It's not so easy as it seems to be, and it has to be linked with the other data sources. And there's many, methodological issues involved in that. So we still also have to. That may be surprising a little bit. Also invest in a basic statistical methodology and that would allow us to use these new data sources, which we didn't foresee to use in the past. The fourth area is scanner data. Scanner data is easy, you know, but some countries are already using it, but there's a majority of countries around the world that are not doing that. So that's a role for us to promote it. Energy meter data and satellite imagery. What we are doing here in Statistics Poland, we especially invested recently in satellite imagery, and we have been for the first time this year producing our estimates on agricultural crops based on satellite imagery, and we just incorporate these new methods into a broader spectrum of applications, and we're very satisfied with that, and we're very proud of that as well. At the same time, of course, AIS, which is like location system analyses and tourism statistics, and a few others. These are the areas that we invest a lot gradually in order to build up, you know, the teams that are able to cope with the complexities of these sources. But this is doable. I can tell you this is really doable. We don't have these. That's very important to say. You know, I remember the beginning of my career when I started my career both at the university and in the bank, the commercial bank, and I was surprised by the fact how not developed it was in terms of digitalization, you know, in today's terms. And on the other hand, that was a big limitation at the back, a big barrier in order to do this, you know, new methods, whatever. You had to invest a lot into software and licenses, whatever. Most of the tools that are necessary nowadays are available as open source, and that's a brilliant, you know, occasion for all of us in order to, in terms of, you know, taking advantage of that, and really you don't need to spend money on that. You just need to train people and just grant yourself an access, which is the main topic of what we're discussing here. So I guess there's one area especially important that is really forgotten very often. It's healthcare systems, you know, the big data in terms of, you know, pulling together the data from different parts of a healthcare system can really, you know, help us in the situations like we have now in pandemics, but also in many other, you know, serious problems, drugs, therapies, healthcare systems. You know, this is the area that can make the biggest difference. But I don't think it's well understood or mentioned enough. And okay, so just to make it a little humorous, I have this kind of a saying, like talking about accessing these data sources like Yeti. You know, everybody talks about it, but no one has really seen him. You know, so the question is what to do. And of course, the pandemic increased the level of innovation, and we all agree. Like when we meet across our, you know, groups of chief statisticians, I meet very often with Anil from Canada, you know, and other my brilliant colleagues. And I always try to harass them with a question, what can you do in order to sustain the level of innovation that you had at the moment? Because I argue that when the situation comes back to normal, you know, we will come back to be very slow and as usual as statistical offices. And they don't like me a little bit for these questions, but at the other hand, they agree to have conferences on that, and on the next OECD committee meeting will be devoted to that topic in particular. So I think that's very important. In the European Union, we're trying to do a lot, and I'm very much engaged into these actions. We had a business to government data sharing expert group established by the European Commission. I was part of this group, and we were working for 2 years and trying to kind of like build up some kind of a document that would, investigate the possibility to create European data spaces and how to facilitate data sharing and things like that. We have, by the way, come up with some set of principles in terms of how we should think about, you know, accessing the privately held data by statistical offices. These principles include the principle of proportionality and minimal data, so we should get the access, but, you know, proportional to what is really needed for the public good. You know, transparency it's obvious. You know, privacy, statistical confidentiality. This is the way we achieve the trust. You know, non-discrimination, a level playing field. That's very important. So that if one company is obliged to do something, then the others operating similarly have to do the same. And of course, following existing statistical frameworks. This is one of the things that we can offer as statistical offices to the creation of data spaces. I mean, we have the standards, metadata standards, all the classifications and things like that, that are the core of the language of sharing the data, so that we can use that together. And of course, the issue of data stewardship was already mentioned, and the role as a steward, at the company, and we need to train people who can be those data stewards as well, and collaborate and creating collaboratives for data sharing. And following this, in the EU, we have the European Statistical System Committee. We have just published a position paper on the European data spaces, arguing for the increased role of the official statistics in creating those European data spaces. I don't want to take too much time on that, but this is an extremely important topic for us, up to the degree that we have, I'm already the president of the Bureau of the European system. So we have just established a few months ago a special task force on access to privately held data. We meet very often, almost once a month, in order to push for creation of the legal basis to access the privately held data for the official statistics within the European Union. And my ambition would be to be also one of the leading regions in the world, as it was in terms of the general data protection regulation, to really establish some kind of legal framework that will allow us to, for the public good, to access the privately held data. At the UN level, we are also working on a global working group on big data and official statistics. We had a general meeting today, but I didn't participate. I couldn't participate in that for some reasons. But I also, within this group, I lead a group task force on capacity and training. And we are developing some kind of programs for national statistical institutes, and so they can just start training their people, using the materials that we produce together. So there's a lot of investment into this area, and I think that's our future. Of course, there's a bigger role than that for the international organizations. I would like to challenge all of the international organizations, not only at the European level, but also OECD. What are you doing, guys, in order to facilitate that? It's not just a question of producing next in each report, fancy report, whatever, but it's a question of achieving the goals actually as quickly as possible. And to summarize my intervention, I would like to come back to something so basic as fundamental principles of official statistics, that they are based on this single fundamental human right to have an access to the truth. And that's what the official statistics is about, that we are there to provide people, individuals, with the necessary information to take informed decisions. And of course, it doesn't really matter if this is the regular source as we imagine it for the last 50 years, or is it administrative records, or are these big data sources privately held data? We are there, we have our obligations, and we have to provide our societies with the necessary information. And times are that we need to use also these new data sources as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and congratulations on all these efforts that Statistics Poland is doing, especially under the mandate of the Global Working Group on Big Data for Official Statistics. I've seen all the work that you have been doing, you and your team, on capacity building. This is really very relevant. But one thing that struck me, listening to you, is that I would say that the culture of data sharing varies from country to country. Maybe private corporations and banks or other type of data providers from the private sectors in Poland may be more open to sharing their data than, let's say, in Brazil or US or in Canada. So this is something that struck me. It is really interesting to see that there is a cultural issue behind these possibilities of data sharing. So thank you very much. Now, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Allison to speak. Professor Allison has been doing a wonderful work in Africa in general, but in South Africa through the center that she is the executive director, the RIA, Research ICT Africa. We have been cooperating in the past years with CETIC, I would say that Professor Allison represents an important organization related to the data production. So, Professor Allison, could you share with us your experience with both demand and supply side statistics production in African countries? And in your view, what are the main challenges that data producers are facing in Africa in terms of accessing alternative data sources? And maybe if you could also, in these 8 minutes, share your thoughts and views on data governance. You have the floor, Professor Allison, please. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and also for the generous introduction. I'm actually going to time myself so that poor Helani actually has time to speak. And if I do run over time, please do stop me if nothing rings a bell or does anything. I think people have raised a lot of the points that I wanted to raise, so I'll try and follow up on certain things. I'm sorry, I've got a very large dog that has now had enough of Zoom for the day. I'm just going to try and get rid of it. I really wanted to just highlight the points that were made around how COVID's really amplified the implications of not having the data. So your question was, how much data do we have in order to monitor the progress towards the SDGs? Well, in fact, across Africa, across a whole lot of the indicators, but particularly across the underlying digital ICT indicators, we don't actually know. We don't know what progress we're making, other than generally we're way off target. But we really don't have the data because it's simply not being collected at the national and the statistical level at all. And I think COVID's really highlighted this. We've seen that governments just don't have a lot of the information that people need in order to make decisions. We've seen even that this digital inequality is playing itself out in the data that's available for COVID mitigation. People are not connected. They're unable to use these technologies for contact tracing, and therefore their data is not coming up. Their data is not coming up on AI dashboards around this. And so effectively in many countries, we actually are resorting to old manual systems because there's such invisibility, such problems with representation in these existing data sets and data methods that you've been referring to. So it's wonderful to know they're there, but they're actually really, for large parts of the world, they're a figment of some northern hemisphere imagination. So what have we got, and what can we do? And I just think that it's important to just identify some of the limitations with some of the data that we do have, because there obviously are enormous potential with big data, and ensuring that this data becomes part of the public good, statistical public available data that is, non-rivalrous and non-excludable. People can use it. It doesn't detract some other company, using that data by using it in an anonymized public way. And we need to think about these complementary forms of data as this, new forms of our national public good databases. So the point is that a lot of the data we're still dependent on is supply side data across Africa, supply side data provided by operators. Very often there isn't the regulatory audits of these, the regulatory institutions audits of these. Very often institutions that are responsible for this within the UN, the ITU, are dependent on our very small, limited number of countries, nationally representative surveys that we are doing. And so I just wanted to emphasize the importance of this, because there's a lot of talk at the moment about how public data can be accessed, and just emphasize the need for us to continue to strive to try and get these nationally representative data sets. And I want to make this point particularly in relation to the internet before moving on to the fact that we need much more data than simply internet connectivity data, which we seem to have settled for in the past. But the supply side data that we're receiving in Africa, and we've seen this in the figures of mobile phone ownership that are over 100%, well over 100%, in countries that we know everybody does not have a phone and that they're well under is that the supply side data simply cannot disaggregate the data. We cannot even get a simple figure as a unique subscriber from that supply side data. We know that we've got multiple SIM cards, we've got IoT SIMs now, et cetera, et cetera. So we really don't even have the most basic information. And then where we do get disaggregated information in various forms, this very often is, this masks the various other policy information that you need around inequality. So the figures that we're seeing around gender, for example, or gender parity or gender differences, these are actually masking the real underlying drivers of inequality. And so for our work on gender, for example, just because it's been touched on but not really spoken at length, really broadly highlights the fact that education and income are the primary determinants of access to education. And so it's really the fact that women are not getting education and therefore the associated incomes with that they're unable to participate. So it's still a matter of poor. It's about intersectional inequality. It's about whether you're in rural areas, which has still continue to have much lower penetration rates than urban areas, etc. This is the only from demand side data can you get that in prepaid mobile markets where people aren't registered and stuff. And even the registration that people have thought is going to be such a wonderful statistical tool. Everybody knows the RICA, the registration of SIM cards is a farce in most countries. I think what we need to do is understand the importance of that. And also I wanted to say from a research point and from an evidence-based policy point of view, it's really only through that nationally representative data that we can do the kind of analysis, the modeling that we need to do in order to really, disaggregate the data and, as I said, unveil the factors that are masked, the inequalities that are masked, to highlight the actual points of policy intervention. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. We can't abandon those. And I should say, in this forum, that the traditional funding that we don't get statistics officers across Africa really doing the kind of in-depth statistics that we need. So we might get an annual household survey or something like that, but that's just about it. And again, we're not using standardized indicators, the international indicators. So they're measuring mobile phones and not household penetration. So we've got enormous problems even around the collection of the most basic statistics. But the important part of this is that we've now been doing these ICT access and use surveys for over a decade in Africa. The data is depended on by the ITU. The World Bank, regularly pleads with us before they can have it before we publicize it, etc. And yet we cannot get sustained funding for this. Public good, public accessible. The database are all made accessible, and yet we can't get funding from that. And even the traditional funding that has come from this, that we've had, it's been remarkable over the last years, decades or more, has dried up. That money is now devoted to artificial intelligence and other things, big data, but you cannot actually get a basic survey done. And I think what's been really interesting about COVID is that we've suddenly had governments saying, where's your data? Why hadn't your data from 2018? What's happened to the next round of data? Well, it's not there. And we really don't understand some of the implications of COVID as a result. So I really want to urge us as an international community to really put those, these are global public goods now. We're talking about global services, global things that we have to govern globally to make effective. And we really need to share those resources, including looking at things like the global digital tax as a very, very small portion of that going towards the kind of indicators we need for governments to be able to use this data meaningfully. And the other, other point I wanted to make about is that we obviously also really need new digital indicators. We're really just looking at old internet indicators. We really need indicators for the digitalization and datification that we're seeing across our economies and societies. And that's really what we try to do with the After Access survey that we did together with Learn Asia and DERSI. And Ria, maybe Helani can just post that After Access link for us while we're speaking. But really that goes beyond, and there's my time. It goes beyond the basic indicators to look at micro work, platform workers, mobile money, that we've done for a long period of time, cybersecurity awareness, data governance, all of the stuff that we really need in order to govern to be able to share data, to be able to allow data to cross borders, these kinds of governance arrangements that we need for data sharing that aren't even in place yet. So we need the empirical demand side data in order to effectively govern these data governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's our great pleasure to listen to your bright insights. I will not summarize what you said because we have to run to get Melanie. So last but definitely not least, I will give the floor to Eleni from Learn Asia, which is a very important think tank in Asia Pacific. You probably know in terms of the work they do and the research they do in terms of policy research on infrastructure industry, including, of course, ICT industry. So Eleni is also very much involved in the production, and is also advocating for the need for data for evidence policymaking. So let me ask you, Eleni, to share your experience with us and give us your insights on issues such as privacy and civil society data sources and privacy of data in the context of a new data ecosystem. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alexander. And thank you, Alison, for putting yourself on timer. I wish all the other panelists actually affected everybody else's time. Thank you. So we are a think tank. We're very much outside of government. We work in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and we do both the traditional survey-related data collections, like the After Access Nationally Representative Data Collection on ICT Access and Use with Alison and other organizations, which is incredibly useful. And over the past 6-7 years, looking rather at big data and algorithmic methods of using new sources of data and also predicting certain social science behaviors using these sources of data. So, as Alison said, I mean, a lot of what is real in the OECD, frankly, is like fiction for us. So we basically have over 90% penetration of cell phones. That's pretty much it. There isn't a whole lot of other things. That is our IoT, people walking around. So what we did, for example, is negotiate 3-month-old on a running basis, so historical, pseudonymized access to call detail records from multiple network operators, for example, in Sri Lanka. And we have used that data to do a whole range of things, including advising governments on transport planning, where multimodal hubs should be. What is the changing nature of the city? In our part of the world, cities are changing so fast that even a 4-year economic census is not going to capture residential versus commercial areas as fast as they change. To capture where people live, where people migrate to at a given time, and to understand where diseases are spreading by combining the people movement data with everything from rainfall and vegetation data and so on. So to understand where the dengue disease spreads. One of the things that we worry about in using this proxy indicator of people is that whether this is really the signal that is seen in the call detail record of a telecom operator is in fact a person, or whether this is multiple people the equivalence of that signal from a human being, I think, is a very important one to address, given phone sharing behaviors that we know and have studied elsewhere. Second, we worry about who is in and who is out. While this is very nice, there's still at least 10% who don't show up with a phone signal. So how do we collect the data about them? And we worry about that all the time. We, of course, worry about the personal information that is represented in these call detail records, because it's nothing is fully anonymized, it's pseudonymized. So we assign a unique identifier, and it is, at least in theory, possible to go back and recreate some proxies for who these people are or where they might live. So in parallel, we are also doing research on how to use these large databases where you can anonymize them to the extent that they are not usable to answering these social science research questions we are asking. Or you can use techniques like creating synthetic data. And we are doing this on creating synthetic data on call detail records, for example. so that you have the same level of confidence and error rates and usability of data sets, but there's a huge level of privacy preservation that also comes in return beyond just pseudonymization. Another type of research we do is to really understand the long-term changes in demand for skills and education. So for example, going back to like UNESCO's, the skill frameworks, transversal skills, for example, we've got data from large job platforms, and we are anonymizing them using natural language processing to understand what are the skills and how has the demand for it changed over short periods like pre and post pandemic, but slightly longer periods, and therefore what are the implications for education policy, vocational training policy, and so on. In both of these, the way we have been able to access data actually provides one of the biggest problems. That is, it is based on relationships. Because we've had the relationships with many of the telecom operators and we've been operating in these markets for a long time, or with the job platforms, we are able to negotiate this data. And unfortunately, this is still how the data is shared. And all the examples I heard from this panel is also because of power or relationships that you get the data, right? While we are a beneficiary of that, we've also been on the other side of this because there is no common agreement on sharing even the basic telecom data. And that's a fundamental problem. Now, in the absence of that, what we have is large multinational companies and platforms coming and doing the reverse, not just giving their data to one party, but coming and negotiating with governments in a way that nobody else can, no other small firm or think tank can, or civil society can, and taking government data, for example, and using it to do very valuable things like highly sensitive flood modeling, which can save lives because compared to the physical modeling of flooding, this can alert people 48 hours before. This is absolutely fantastic, and they can issue an alert. But why would the government not make that data available to every insurance provider and every research organization in the country? Second, what are the implications of over time relying heavily on a model that is developed on data from India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, America, and so on, and getting the results versus developing that capacity in our countries? Because over time, you're going to lose that capacity, and you're going to lose the ability to build sophisticated models unless you have access to the code, the model, and the algorithm, right, used by a multinational. So the next time the flood hits and the multinational algorithm is wrong, who's going to take accountability for this? I think we're not addressing a lot of these issues, and the whole ecosystem around data governance and sharing is problematic. Big players are at an advantage. Relationships are at an advantage. Singapore is, I think, doing some interesting work looking at ways small players can come in, contribute with their own data instead of having to make payments to access data. We run into the problem of data provenance whenever we talk to an NSO using these new methods. Yeah, well, we don't, it's a skill issue, right? They don't know how to do it. It's a very different conversation from a Stats Canada that we have, in many of the South Asian countries. How do you do it? Well, is the model really reliable? Transport modeling has been done, in this way for 10 years and so on. I will stop there. There are regulatory ways of getting people to come to the table. There are incentives, which many of the people talked about, and there are other innovative ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleni, because you highlighted the fact that the context, the regional context, like you're talking about Asia and Southeast Asia, is very different from Africa, from Latin America, of course, from Europe and global North in general. And this poses different challenges in terms of access and data sources, and also in terms of fundings and sustainability through time. So those are very important issues that you have to keep in mind, because we are not talking about the same level of development in all these regions, Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia. So thank you so much. I'm really sorry that we are running out of time. We have some questions. Just for the matter, we had people following here in Zoom as participants, and also YouTube. As if I'm not mistaken, The peak of participants were in the total Zoom plus YouTube about 45 people, which is a quite good audience for this topic. And if you are here, participants, dear participants, is because you have interest in data and in statistics and data production. And I think that some participants brought some questions that we are not going to have time to reply, but I would like at least to acknowledge and to read them. We have 5 questions. 2 of them was already replied by Jacob from UNESCO. So we have one. Could you please share the data governance model used to gain insight for real-time decision-making? Second, how does data ownership, data stewardship managed in a heterogeneous platform with public-private partnerships, PPP, considering trust, transparency to obtain a sharing economy? Another question, regarding the organic data sources accumulated by private entities, often used for private purposes, such as competitive insight, innovation, etc., how can we encourage owners to share their data with regional statistical office for the production of public statistics? Next, so far we have discussed the collection of data to monitor the SDGs, but I would like to be, I also would be interested to know whether the organizations represented here also model this data to predict the development of SDGs fulfillment. That's a very difficult question. How can we assure that no one uses national data shared in global level for illegitimate geopolitical goals? I think that we need globally agree that governance convention under the UN framework is in this regard. Another one, how does the African Union has any plan for better data in Africa? And last, what is the UNESCO UIS playing in, what part or what role is UNESCO playing, UIS playing in ICT data collection for monitoring the SDGs? So very interesting questions, but unfortunately we don't have time to discuss. I think that for me, I could learn a lot from your experience and your insights. Of course, that we didn't even touch it. Things like bias of big data, coverage, the issues related to coverage. I guess that Alison has mentioned about representativeness of data for evidence-based policymaking. This is another issue. Privacy, sustainability, funding. So all these issues are important to be in the debate. I think that today was just a flavor of what is waiting for us, data producers and key stakeholders in these ecosystems to discuss. I was about to ask 1 minute round of a last comment, but I think I will skip that part because it's not possible to give a good message in 1 minute. So I would like to finish by thanking all the speakers. I really appreciate your time, appreciate your being here. And I would like to read what the UN IGF organizer has asked to inform a call for voluntary commitments. So there is a call for voluntary commitment that has been launched. It is a call for voluntary actions or pledges to forward the goals of the Internet Governance Forum in the Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. This is really relevant in my opinion. Any stakeholders can make a voluntary commitment of an action to be carried out during the 2021 cycle until next year, IGF 2021, that I really hope that we can be together face to face in Poland, I hope, or beyond, actions that are supportive and for achieving or implementing IGF objectives or action areas related to the Secretary General's roadmap. Therefore, as the moderator of this panel, I invite all of you to respond the call for these voluntary commitments. Your commitments can be done either verbally during this session that is finished right now, and if you prefer, you can submit them through the form available for that purpose, which will also be facilitated in our chat box. So I guess that Ana Laura has already disseminated this link for this for you to reply, but I will make sure that we will send an email to you with the link. So self-reporting and self-evaluation of these voluntary commitments will be made possible through the IGF Secretariat website and will be reviewed at the first open consultation. Thank you so much for your commitment, and please stay safe. I send all the best energies to you in this very difficult and very strange moment that we're living. And definitely data production, data sharing, data governance is going to be a hot topic for us. And we have a responsibility in this debate. Thank you so much, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.